Years after she married the future King of England, Princess Diana sat in front of a private camera, working with a voice coach, and said something about love that almost nobody was supposed to hear. She said that when she was 24, 25 years old, already married to Prince Charles, already the most photographed woman in the world, she had fallen deeply in love with someone, not her husband, a man who worked inside her own household. She said he was the greatest friend she had ever had. She said she was only happy when he was around. She said she would have been perfectly content to give it all up, the palace, the title, the entire royal life, and simply go off and live with him. And then she said what happened to him. It was all found out, she said, and he was chucked out, and then he was killed. His name was Barry Mannakee. He was her bodyguard, and Diana, on that private tape, said that his death was the biggest blow of her life. She said, in her own voice, that she thought he had been, in her words, bumped off, removed, that his death in a motorcycle accident, months after he was quietly transferred away from her, was not an accident at all. The world remembers Diana's loves as a scandalous list. James Hewitt, the riding instructor, Dodi Fayed, the man who died beside her in Paris. The affairs the tabloids splashed across their front pages for years. But the real story of who Diana loved, and who loved her, is not that list, and it is far sadder than that list, because it is the story of a woman who wanted, more than fame, more than glamour, more than the crown, one simple thing that she was never reliably given in her entire life. She wanted to be loved. Truly, securely, faithfully loved by someone who wanted her for herself. And she spent her whole life reaching for it, in the wrong places and the right ones, because the very first lesson life had taught her, as a small child, was that the people you love most can walk out the door and not come back. Because before Charles, before the bodyguard, before the surgeon she would later call the love of her life, before any of it, there was a little girl standing at a window at Park House, watching her mother drive away, listening to the sound of the car on the gravel, a sound she said she would never forget as long as she lived. This is the real story of who Princess Diana loved, not the tabloid list, the true one, the bodyguard the palace took away, the surgeon who would not marry her, and the man the whole world thought was her great love but probably wasn't. And underneath all of them, the wound that drove the entire search, the little girl who learned before she was old enough to understand it, that love, in her family, was something that left. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The search for love that defined Diana's entire life began with a loss she was too young to fully understand and never fully recovered from. She was born Diana Frances Spencer on July 1st, 1961, at Park House, a rented home on the Queen's Sandringham estate in Norfolk. The Spencers were old English aristocracy, a family older and in some ways grander than the royal family itself, and Diana grew up in privilege, in a large house with servants, on land that belonged to the monarch. On the surface, it was an idyllic setting for a childhood, rambling grounds, a big house, ponies, the trappings of the English upper class. Underneath, the home was troubled, and it was about to break apart in a way that would shape Diana forever. Her parents, John Spencer, then Viscount Althorp, and Frances, had a marriage that was failing badly. There had been enormous pressure on Frances to produce a male heir, the son who would carry on the Spencer line and inherit the earldom. Before Diana, the couple had lost an infant son, John, who lived only hours, a tragedy that haunted the family. Diana, arriving as another daughter when a son was desperately wanted, later came to believe that her very birth had been something of a disappointment to a family longing for a boy. It was a hard thing for a child to absorb, the sense that you were not quite what was hoped for, and it planted early the feeling that would follow her all her life, that she had to earn love, that she was not automatically worthy of it. Then, when Diana was 6 years old, her mother left. Frances had fallen in love with another man, and she left the marriage, and the family shattered. What followed was a bitter, painful divorce, and an ugly custody battle, and at the center of it were the children, including little Diana. The details of that period were the kind of thing that marks a child permanently, and the single image that Diana carried from it, the one she spoke about later, was the sound of her mother's car driving away across the gravel, taking her mother out of the daily life of the house, leaving Diana behind. For a 6-year-old, this is not an abstract event. It is the fundamental structure of the world rearranging itself into something frightening. The person a small child loves most, depends on most, needs most, was suddenly gone, and no explanation a 6-year-old could understand made it make sense. Diana learned, at that age, in her body, before she had the words for it, the lesson that would drive everything: that love is not safe, that the people you love most can leave, that you can be, at any moment, abandoned, and that there may be nothing you can do to stop it. The custody arrangement left Diana and her siblings primarily with their father, and while he loved his children, John Spencer was, by the accounts that survive, an emotionally reserved and undemonstrative man, of a generation and a class that did not do open affection well. Diana grew up, then, with a mother who had left, and a father who could not easily show warmth, in a big cold house where the love she craved was in short supply. She and her younger brother Charles, who would later become Earl Spencer and deliver that famous, furious eulogy at her funeral, were the two youngest, and they leaned on each other through the loneliness. The wound of the mother leaving expressed itself in the way such wounds do. Diana grew into a girl who was, on the one hand, desperate for love and affection and approval, reaching for it constantly, and on the other hand, braced always for the possibility of being abandoned again. This combination, the deep hunger for love plus the deep fear of losing it, is a recipe for exactly the kind of turbulent emotional life Diana would go on to have. People shaped this way tend to love intensely, to need reassurance constantly, to give themselves completely, and to be devastated beyond measure when love is withdrawn, because every loss reopens the original one. Every abandonment is, on some level, the mother's car on the gravel all over again. She was not a scholar. She struggled academically, left school without distinguishing herself in the classroom, and was, by every account, far more gifted emotionally than intellectually. She was warm. She was drawn to small children and to anyone who was suffering, a quality that would later make her beloved around the world as she sat with AIDS patients and the dying and the poor. She understood pain because she carried it, and she recognized it in others. And she was, as a teenager, a romantic. She dreamed of love, of marriage, of a great fairy tale devotion that would give her, at last, the security and the belonging that had been ripped away when she was 6. She kept herself, famously, romantically inexperienced, almost deliberately unspoiled, as though saving herself for the great love she believed was coming. She had a schoolgirl's dream of being swept up into a perfect romance. And then, when she was still just a teenager, the most eligible bachelor in the world began to take an interest in her. He was the heir to the British throne. He was going to be king, and to a 19-year-old girl who had wanted, since she was 6, nothing more than to be truly and permanently loved, he must have seemed like the answer to everything. He was not. He was, in a sense, the beginning of the deepest heartbreak of all, because Prince Charles was in love with someone else, and Diana was about to marry him anyway. Diana first met Charles in November of 1977, when she was just 16 years old, and the circumstances tell you everything about how little the meeting had to do with her. He was not there for Diana. He was dating her older sister, Sarah. Charles, then in his late 20s and under mounting pressure to find a suitable bride, had come to Althorpe, the Spencer family estate, for a grouse hunt as the guest of Diana's sister. And in a ploughed field, Diana, 16 years old, was introduced to the Prince of Wales, who was, at that moment, romantically involved with her sibling. Charles later recalled her as a jolly, amusing, bouncy 16-year-old, full of life. Diana, for her part, is said to have recalled thinking, upon seeing this sad, older man, something closer to pity than passion. But she also, according to the account she gave later, formed a private conviction that would prove eerily prophetic. She reportedly told friends around that time that she was going to marry Charles one day, and she is said to have joked that he was the one man on the planet who was not allowed to divorce her. It was the fantasy of a romantic teenage girl, half a joke, but it revealed the dream that lived inside her, to be chosen, permanently, by someone who could never leave. 3 years passed, and in the summer of 1980, Diana, now 19, crossed paths with Charles again, at the home of a mutual friend. This time the dynamic was different. Charles was single again, and he was grieving. His beloved great-uncle and mentor, Lord Mountbatten, had been assassinated by the IRA less than a year earlier, and Charles was still raw from the loss. Diana, with the emotional attentiveness that was her deepest gift, sat with him and spoke to him about his grief, about how sad he had looked at the funeral, about how he needed someone to look after him. She reached for his pain, the way she always reached for pain, and Charles responded to it. The romance, such as it was, moved quickly, and it moved under an intense and unforgiving spotlight. The moment the press realized the Prince of Wales was seriously courting the young, pretty, aristocratic Lady Diana Spencer, they descended on her, and her life was never private again. She was hounded, photographed, followed, and through it all she conducted herself with a poise that impressed the royal family. And crucially, she met the single most important qualification the establishment demanded of a future queen. She was, by the standards of the time and the institution, considered suitable and unspoiled, a young woman with no romantic past to cause scandal. Here is the detail that reveals how thin the foundation actually was. By Diana's own later account, she and Charles met only about 13 times before he proposed. 13 times. They barely knew each other. This was not a great romance that had deepened over years into a decision to marry. It was a courtship conducted at speed, under pressure, driven by Charles's need to find an appropriate bride, and by the establishment's approval of Diana as the right sort of girl. Diana, 19 years old, romantic, hungry to be loved, and dazzled by the fairy tale of it, said yes. And then came the moment that Diana would later describe as one of the most wounding of her life, the moment that should have been the happiest, and instead planted a seed of devastation. When Charles and Diana gave their official engagement interview, a reporter asked them if they were in love. Diana answered simply, "Of course." Charles, standing beside his young fiancée, gave an answer that has echoed down the decades as one of the coldest things a man ever said about the woman he was about to marry. He said, "Whatever love is, whatever love is." Diana, on those private tapes years later, said that remark had absolutely traumatized her. She had said she was in love. He had responded with a philosophical shrug, a refusal to simply say yes. And she understood, on some level, even then, what it meant. It meant that Charles was not marrying her because he loved her the way she loved him. He was marrying her because she was suitable, because the institution required it, because it was time, because Charles was in love with someone else, and Diana knew it, or was about to. The someone else was Camilla Parker Bowles. Charles had loved Camilla for years, had loved her before Diana, had continued a relationship and an emotional bond with her that had never truly ended. And in the months before the wedding, Diana discovered the depth of it. She found evidence of the ongoing connection. She learned that the man she was about to marry had another woman at the center of his heart, and that she, Diana, the 19-year-old bride the whole world was celebrating, was not the one he loved. She thought about not going through with it. She later said she felt, in the days before the wedding, like a lamb to the slaughter. She confided her doubts. But the machine was already in motion. The dress was made, the guests invited, the whole world watching, the fairy tale sold to a global audience of hundreds of millions. A 19-year-old girl who had wanted, since she was 6, to be permanently and securely loved, could not find the power to stop the largest wedding in the history of the world, even though she had already discovered that the groom's heart belonged to another woman. On July 29, 1981, Diana Spencer walked down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral and married the Prince of Wales, in front of a global television audience of an estimated 750 million people. The world saw a fairy tale. Diana saw the beginning of the loneliest chapter of her life, married to a man who loved someone else, trapped inside an institution that would not protect her, and about to discover that being the most famous woman on earth is no cure at all for wanting and not having the one thing you have needed since childhood. The marriage was in trouble almost immediately, and the trouble took the specific form that Diana's whole life had prepared her to suffer most. She was surrounded by people, celebrated by the world, and profoundly, achingly alone. Charles did not stop seeing Camilla, or at least did not stop loving her, and Diana knew it, and the knowledge ate at her. She was a young woman in her early 20s, isolated inside the rigid and unwelcoming machinery of the royal household, married to a man 15 years her senior who was emotionally unavailable to her and whose heart was elsewhere. The warmth she craved, the reassurance she needed, the simple daily affection that might have healed some of the old childhood wound, none of it was there. Instead, there was coldness, distance, protocol, and the constant, suffocating awareness of the other woman. Diana would later describe the situation in the most famous single sentence she ever spoke, in her 1995 television interview, when she said that there were 3 of them in the marriage, so it was a bit crowded. 3 people, herself, Charles, and Camilla. It was, she said, a marriage that never had a chance to be what a marriage should be, because from the very beginning there was someone else at the center of her husband's heart. And Diana, shaped since childhood to equate the loss of love with abandonment and to internalize rejection as her own failure, did not respond to this the way a more secure person might have. She collapsed inward. The pain turned against her own body. She developed bulimia, the eating disorder that would torment her for years, a condition deeply tied to anxiety, to a need for control when everything feels out of control, to self-punishment and emotional starvation. She engaged in self-harm. She was, by her own later testimony, desperately unhappy, and her unhappiness expressed itself in ways that frightened those around her and that the palace regarded not with compassion but with embarrassment and alarm. This is one of the cruelest parts of the story. Diana was a young woman in genuine psychological crisis, drowning in loneliness and rejection inside her own marriage, and the institution she had married into largely responded by treating her distress as a problem to be managed, an inconvenience, a sign of instability, rather than as the entirely comprehensible suffering of a person who had married a man who loved someone else and found herself trapped and alone. She reached out for help and support and found, by her account, little of it. The royal family was not, by temperament or tradition, equipped to offer the emotional rescue that Diana needed. They wanted her to perform the role, to look beautiful, to produce heirs, which she did, giving birth to William in 1982 and Harry in 1984, and to keep her private pain private. So there she was, by the mid-1980s, in her early 20s, the most photographed, most admired, most envied woman on the planet, adored by millions of strangers, and starved of love by the one person who was supposed to provide it. She had achieved the fairy tale the whole world had celebrated, and inside it she was lonelier than she had ever been. And a person in that condition, a person with Diana's specific history and specific hungers, does not simply endure the starvation forever. She reaches for warmth wherever she can find it. She had spent her whole life reaching for love. She was not going to stop now, married or not, princess or not. The need was too old and too deep. The warmth, when she finally found it, did not come from a prince or a duke or a member of her glittering social world. It came from a member of her own staff, a man whose job was, quite literally, to protect her, a kind, reassuring, down-to-earth man who was around her constantly, who paid attention to her, who treated her not as a royal asset or a public performance, but as a frightened young woman who needed looking after. His name was Barry Mannakee. He was a police officer with the Royal Protection Squad, assigned as Diana's bodyguard around 1985. He was in his late 30s, married, a father of two, a solid and unglamorous man from an ordinary background, about as far from the world of princes and palaces as it was possible to be. And Diana, at 24, lonely beyond description, began to fall in love with him. It was not, by the accounts that survive, primarily a physical affair, though the exact nature of it has been debated. What it was, above all, was emotional. Mannakee gave Diana the thing she was starving for. He made her feel safe. He made her feel seen. He made her feel, for the first time since the fairy tale had curdled, that someone in her daily life actually cared about her as a person. She said later, on those private tapes, that she was only happy when he was around, that she wandered around the palace trying to catch sight of him, that she wore her heart on her sleeve. She said something else, too, something that reveals just how deep this went, and just how desperate she was for a way out of the gilded misery of her marriage. She said she would have been quite happy to give it all up, the palace, the position, the entire royal existence, and simply go off and live with him. And, she added, he kept saying he thought that was a good idea too. A princess, the future queen, the mother of the future king, was privately dreaming of walking away from all of it, the whole royal world, to run off with her bodyguard, because he was the first person in years to make her feel loved. The palace, of course, could not allow it, and when the closeness between Diana and Barry Mannakee was discovered, the institution moved to end it, quickly and quietly. What happened next would haunt Diana for the rest of her life. When the royal household discovered how close Diana and Barry Mannakee had become, they did what institutions do with an inconvenient relationship. They removed the man. Quietly, efficiently, and without regard for what it would do to the young woman who had come to depend on him. In 1986, Mannakee was transferred off Diana's protection detail, moved to the Diplomatic Protection Group in central London. His superiors had determined that his relationship with the Princess of Wales had become, in the word that was used, inappropriate. There was no public announcement, no scandal at the time, nothing that reached the newspapers. A bodyguard was simply reassigned, an ordinary administrative act, the kind of thing that happens in any large organization. Except that for Diana, it was the removal of the one person who had made her feel loved. And it was, in its structure, a devastating echo of the original wound. Once again, someone she loved was taken away from her. Once again, the car on the gravel. She was heartbroken, but the heartbreak of the transfer was nothing compared to what came next. On May 15, 1987, less than a year after he was moved off her detail, Barry Mannakee was killed. He was a passenger on a motorcycle, being driven by a colleague when it was involved in a collision with a car. He died of his injuries. He was 39 years old. Diana learned of his death, by one account, while she was in a car with Prince Charles, on the way to an event, and she had to absorb the news and then continue on to a public appearance, performing composure while something inside her broke. She could not grieve openly. She could not tell anyone what he had truly meant to her. The man she had loved, the man she had fantasized about giving up everything for, was dead, and she had to keep it secret, had to swallow the grief, because the relationship had never been acknowledged and never could be. Years later, on the private tapes she made with her voice coach Peter Setterlin, Diana finally spoke about it, and the pain in her words is unmistakable, even in transcript. She said that when she was 24, 25, she had fallen deeply in love with someone who worked in her environment, that he was the greatest friend she had ever had. And she described what happened to him with a terrible economy. It was all found out, she said, and he was chucked out, and then he was killed. And that, she said, was the biggest blow of my life, the biggest blow of her life. Consider everything Diana endured, the collapse of her marriage, the betrayals, the public humiliations, the eating disorder, the loneliness, and yet it was the death of Barry Mannakee that she named, privately, as the biggest blow of all. Because he was the one who had loved her back, simply and without agenda, and losing him was losing the proof that she was lovable at all. And then she said the thing that turned a private grief into a lifelong torment. She said she believed he had been, in her word, bumped off. Killed deliberately. She did not think his death was an accident. She thought that the establishment, having discovered the relationship and removed him, had then somehow arranged his death, eliminated him, to make absolutely certain that the Princess of Wales could never run off with her bodyguard. It has to be said clearly, in fairness to the truth, that there is no evidence for this. An inquest examined Mannakee's death and found it to be exactly what it appeared to be, a genuine and tragic road accident. Diana's own former bodyguard, Ken Wharf, who knew her well, stated flatly that he did not believe there was any truth to the idea that Mannakee had been killed, that it was simply a terrible accident, and that Diana, in her grief and her deepening distrust of the establishment, had been prone to believe dark theories. There is every reason to think Wharf is right, that the death was an accident, and that Diana's belief that Barry had been murdered was the product of genuine trauma curdling into paranoia. But whether or not it was true is almost beside the point when it comes to understanding Diana. What matters is that she believed it. She went through the rest of her life believing that loving her had gotten a good man killed, that the institution she had married into was capable of eliminating people who got too close to her, that her love was, in a sense, dangerous to the people who received it. Imagine carrying that. Imagine believing that the one man who had loved you purely had been murdered for it, and that you could never say so out loud, never mourn him publicly, never even acknowledge that he had mattered. Diana carried exactly that, in secret, for the last decade of her life. The Barry Mannakee chapter is the hidden key to everything that came after it, and it is the part of Diana's story that the tabloid list of lovers completely misses. Because after Barry, Diana's search for love did not stop, it intensified, but it was now shadowed by loss and by fear and by the deep, confirmed belief that love, for her, came with catastrophe attached. She would love again. She would reach again for the warmth she had always needed, but the innocence was gone. The girl who had dreamed of a fairy tale was now a woman who had learned, brutally, that in her world, the people who loved her got taken away. The next man to give her what she needed would be someone who taught her to ride, and he would break her heart in an entirely different way, not by dying, but by living, and by selling her secrets to the world. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The man who taught Diana to ride again, in every sense, was named James Hewitt, and their relationship was the one that would become the most public, the most exploited, and in the end, the most humiliating of her life. They met in 1986, around the same painful period when Barry Mannakee was being taken from her. Hewitt was a cavalry officer in the British Army, a household cavalryman, handsome, confident, an accomplished horseman. Diana had a long-standing fear of horses, dating back to a childhood fall, and Hewitt offered to help her overcome it through riding lessons. The lessons began, and so, before long, did the affair. What Hewitt gave Diana was, at first, exactly what she had been starving for, and exactly what Mannakee had given her: attention, affection, warmth, the feeling of being desired and cared for. By the accounts of those close to the situation, including Diana's bodyguard Ken Wharf, Hewitt was attentive and affectionate in a way that Charles simply was not, and Diana, still reeling from the loss of Mannakee and still trapped in a loveless marriage, responded to that attention with the whole force of her hungry heart. The relationship lasted around 5 years, from roughly 1986 to 1991. They met in private, at his mother's cottage in Devon, away from the cameras. Diana wrote him letters, long, loving letters, including when Hewitt was deployed to the Gulf War in 1991, and she waited anxiously for his safe return. For a while, it was, by Diana's own later admission, a genuine love affair and a genuine source of happiness in an otherwise miserable time. When she was finally asked about it directly, In her explosive 1995 television interview, she did not deny it or hide behind euphemism. Asked whether she had been unfaithful, she said of Hewitt that yes, she had adored him, that yes, she had been in love with him. It was a remarkable admission for a member of the royal family to make on television, and she made it plainly, because by then she was done pretending. But she added something crucial in that same interview. She said she had been let down, devastated, in fact, by what Hewitt had done, because James Hewitt, the man she had loved and trusted, had betrayed her in a way that cut to the core of her deepest fear. In 1994, Hewitt cooperated with a writer named Anna Pasternak on a book called Princess in Love, which laid bare the details of his affair with Diana. He sold their private relationship, their intimacy, their letters' contents, their secret happiness, to the public for money and attention. The love affair that had been a rare source of comfort in Diana's darkest years was turned into a commercial product, a tell-all, a betrayal published for the world to consume. And Hewitt would continue, for years afterward, to trade on his relationship with Diana, trying at various points to sell her actual love letters, appearing in documentaries, making himself into a professional former lover of the Princess of Wales. For Diana, this was a specific and terrible kind of wound. She had given Hewitt her trust and her love, and he had monetized it. The pattern of her life reasserted itself in a new and cruel form: love given, love betrayed, abandonment confirmed. Barry had been taken by death. Hewitt took himself, and took her secrets with him, and sold them. Either way, the lesson Diana had learned at 6 years old held: the people you love leave, or are taken, or turn out not to be safe. It would be easy, looking at the tabloid version of Diana's life, to see the Hewitt affair as simply scandal, a princess cheating on her husband. But that reading misses the whole truth of it. Diana was a woman trapped in a marriage to a man who loved someone else, a man who had, by many accounts, returned to his own affair with Camilla. She was not betraying a loving husband. She was reaching, out of a marriage that had starved her for years, for the human warmth that every person needs and that she had been denied. That the reaching led her to a man who would ultimately exploit her was part of her tragedy, not her crime. By the early 1990s, the marriage of Charles and Diana had collapsed entirely, and it collapsed in public, in the most humiliating way imaginable. There were the leaked tapes, the competing tell-all books, the dueling television interviews, the whole grim spectacle that the press dubbed the War of the Waleses. Diana cooperated with Andrew Morton on a book that told her side, revealing the bulimia, the suicidal despair, the loneliness, the truth about Camilla. Charles gave his own television interview admitting his adultery. The fairy tale that 750 million people had watched in 1981 disintegrated in front of the entire world. Charles and Diana separated in 1992 and would divorce in 1996. And Diana, now free, or freer, of the marriage that had caused her so much pain, remained what she had always been, a woman searching for love. The difference now was that she was no longer a naive teenager. She was a woman in her 30s who had been married and betrayed, who had loved and lost, who had been exploited and humiliated, and who still, underneath all of it, wanted the same simple thing she had wanted since she was 6 years old at that window: to be truly loved by someone who would stay. She was about to meet the man she would call the love of her life, and he would turn out to be the one who hurt her most of all, not by betraying her, but by refusing to do the one thing she needed, which was to let the whole world see that he loved her. In September of 1995, Diana went to the Royal Brompton Hospital in London to visit a friend who was recovering from heart surgery, and there, in the hospital corridors, she met the man she would come to call the love of her life. His name was Hasnat Khan. He was a British-Pakistani heart and lung surgeon, brilliant at his work, and in almost every way the opposite of the men Diana's world was full of. He was not glamorous, not aristocratic, not wealthy, not interested in fame. He was a serious, private, dedicated doctor who spent his days doing genuinely important work, saving lives on the operating table. Diana, visiting the hospital, watched him and was captivated by his skill, by his dedication, by his substance. Here was a man who did something real, who healed people, who lived for something beyond status and appearance. She fell, and she fell hard. The relationship that developed between Diana and Hasnat Khan lasted around 2 years, and by every serious account, it was the deepest and most genuine romantic love of Diana's adult life. She called him, affectionately, Mr. Wonderful. Her friends believed he was the true love of her life, the one who reached her most completely. Her butler, Paul Burrell, later testified that Diana described Khan as her soulmate, as the man she loved more than any other. This was not the exploited, tabloid-driven affair that Hewitt had become. This was something private and real, conducted, as much as Diana's life allowed, away from the cameras. And Diana threw herself into it with the totality that was characteristic of her. She wanted to understand his world, so she immersed herself in it. She read about Islam and about Pakistani culture. She wore shalwar kameez, the traditional dress. She traveled to Pakistan. She spent time with Khan's family. She reportedly considered converting to Islam. She was, by all accounts, willing to reshape her entire life around this man, because he was, finally, the real thing, the love she had been searching for since childhood. She wanted to marry him. This is the part that reveals how serious it was for her. Diana, the mother of the future king, actually explored the practical possibility of marrying Hasnat Khan. She asked her butler to look into whether a private, secret wedding might be possible. She thought about the logistics, about giving him rooms at Kensington Palace, about a second home in Pakistan. She was not fantasizing idly. She was trying to find a way to actually build a life with this man, to make him her husband, to finally have the secure, permanent, real love she had wanted her whole life. But Hasnat Khan did not want the life that loving Diana would require. This was the heart of the problem, and it was insurmountable. Khan was an intensely private man who valued his anonymity and his work above almost everything. He had seen what the media did to Diana, the relentless, suffocating, inescapable attention, and he wanted no part of it. He understood that to marry Diana, or even to be publicly known as her partner, would mean the end of his private life, the end of his ability to simply be a surgeon, the transformation of himself into a global tabloid figure. He could not face it. He did not want to live his life as an exhibit, hunted by photographers, his every move documented. And so, despite loving her, he pulled back from the future Diana wanted. According to Diana's friend Rosa Monckton, it was Khan who initiated the breakup, who ended the relationship, because the gulf between their two lives was simply too wide to bridge. The relationship ended, painfully, in the early summer of 1997. For Diana, it was another devastating loss, and a particularly cruel one, because this time it was not death that took the man, as with Mannakee, and not betrayal, as with Hewitt. This time the man loved her and left anyway, because loving her openly cost more than he was willing to pay. She had finally found real love, and it turned out that the very thing that made her Diana, her fame, the world's obsession with her, was the thing that made that love impossible to keep. Think about the terrible logic of it from Diana's perspective. She had wanted, since she was 6 years old, to be truly and permanently loved. She had become the most famous and adored woman on the planet, loved by hundreds of millions of strangers. And that very fame, that very universal love, was precisely what prevented the one private, personal, permanent love she actually wanted, because no ordinary man who valued a normal life could bear to live inside the hurricane of attention that surrounded her. The love of the whole world had made the love of one man impossible. Devastated by the end of the relationship with Khan, Diana did something that summer that would prove, in hindsight, to be the beginning of the end. She turned her attention toward another man, one who was everything Khan was not, wealthy, worldly, and entirely comfortable with the spotlight. A man whose family owned Harrods and the Ritz. a man who would sweep her onto yachts in the Mediterranean and into the full glare of the world's cameras. His name was Dodi Fayed, and some of the people who knew Diana best believed that her sudden, very public romance with Dodi that summer was, at least in part, an attempt to make Hasnat Khan jealous, to prove to the man she really loved that she was desired, to try to win back the one she actually wanted by flaunting another. If that is true, and several of her friends believed it was, then the final chapter of Diana's life was set in motion not by love for Dodi, but by heartbreak over Khan. And that final chapter was going to end, 6 weeks later, in a tunnel in Paris. The last summer of Diana's life unfolded in the full glare of the world's cameras, on yachts and in the south of France, in a romance that the entire planet watched and that may not have been quite what it appeared to be. Dodi Fayed was the son of Mohammed Al-Fayed, the Egyptian billionaire who owned Harrods and the Ritz Hotel in Paris. Dodi was a film producer, wealthy, charming, accustomed to luxury and to the company of famous people, and entirely unbothered by publicity. In the summer of 1997, in the aftermath of her heartbreak over Hasnat Khan, Diana entered into a whirlwind romance with him. They holidayed together in the Mediterranean aboard the Al-Fayed yacht. They were photographed constantly. The images beamed around the world. Diana, in a swimsuit on the deck. Diana and Dodi together, the most famous woman alive with her glamorous new billionaire companion. The photographs were everywhere, and that may have been precisely the point, because several of the people who knew Diana best believed that the very public nature of the Dodi romance was, at least partly, a performance aimed at an audience of one. They believed Diana was still, in her heart, burning for Hasnat Khan, and that the images of her happiness with Dodi were meant to reach Khan, to make him jealous, to show him what he had given up, to try to provoke him into coming back and claiming her. Her butler Paul Burrell, among others, believed she was still carrying a candle for Khan, even as she was photographed with Dodi. If that is true, then the great final romance the world was watching was, on some level, not really about Dodi at all. It was one more move in Diana's lifelong, desperate campaign to secure the love she actually wanted. We will never know how the Dodi relationship would have developed, whether it would have deepened into something real or faded once its purpose was served, because it was given no time. In the early hours of August 31st, 1997, in Paris, Diana and Dodi left the Ritz Hotel, pursued as always by paparazzi, in a Mercedes driven by Henri Paul. The car sped into the Pont de l'Alma tunnel and crashed. Dodi Fayed was killed, Henri Paul was killed, and Diana, Princess of Wales, gravely injured, died a few hours later in a Paris hospital. She was 36 years old. The woman who had spent her entire life searching for love died in a car being chased by photographers, hunted to the very end by the world's insatiable hunger for her image, the same relentless attention that had made real, private love so impossible for her to hold. The grief that followed was unlike anything the modern world had seen. Hundreds of thousands of people came to London. The oceans of flowers outside the palaces became a sea. An estimated 2.5 billion people watched her funeral, one of the largest television audiences in the history of the world. The woman who had felt, for so much of her life, unloved and abandoned, was mourned by more people than perhaps anyone who had ever lived. The love of the entire world poured out for her, finally, overwhelmingly, and she was not alive to feel a moment of it. That is the central, unbearable irony of Diana's life, and it is the thing the tabloid list of lovers never captures. She was loved by billions, and struggled her entire life to be loved by one. She had all the love in the world, the abstract, adoring, distant love of strangers, and almost never the thing she actually needed, the close, safe, permanent love of a person who would stay. Look at the whole shape of it. A little girl at a window at Park House, 6 years old, listening to her mother's car drive away across the gravel, learning before she had the words for it that love leaves. A romantic teenager who dreamed of a fairy tale and married a prince who loved another woman. A lonely young wife who found warmth at last in a kind bodyguard, only to have him taken away and then killed, and to spend the rest of her life believing, rightly or wrongly, that loving her had gotten him murdered. A betrayed woman who reached for comfort with a riding instructor, who sold her secrets to the world. And finally, a mature woman who found, in a private and dedicated surgeon, the real and total love she had wanted since childhood, only to lose him because the fame that made the whole world adore her was the very thing that made one man's love impossible to keep. Barry Mannakee, the bodyguard, taken by death. James Hewitt, the soldier, lost to betrayal. Hasnat Khan, the surgeon, the love of her life, lost because loving her openly cost more than he could bear. And Dodi Fayed, the last companion, possibly just a means of reaching the man she truly wanted, gone with her into the tunnel. Who did Diana really love? The honest answer is that she loved, most deeply and most truly, Hasnat Khan, the quiet surgeon she called Mr. Wonderful, the one she wanted to marry, the one who got away, not because he stopped loving her, but because he could not survive being loved by her in public. And beneath even that, the person Diana loved longest and reached for hardest was not any single man at all. It was the idea of being safely, permanently, unconditionally loved, the thing she had lost at 6 and chased for the remaining 30 years of her life, and never quite held on to, no matter how many millions adored her from a distance. She was the most loved woman in the world, and she died still looking for the one love that would have been enough, the love that would simply stay, and never drive away across the gravel, and never leave her standing at the window listening. That was Diana, not the fairy tale, and not the scandal. A girl who wanted to be loved, who was loved by everyone, and held by almost no one, and who spent her whole brief, luminous, heartbroken life reaching for the one thing all the love in the world could never quite give her. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.